So as I mentioned in the overview of Unit 4, we're moving from the Persian period through the Hellenistic period down to the early Roman era that ends in approximately 70 AD. So we want to look back at the Persian era and the restoration of the Israelites, and particularly the area of Jerusalem, the Judeans and others, back to Jerusalem in this context of the Persian era. As I mentioned, Ezra comes back as a teacher of Torah. In the backdrop of the religious developments of the era, we have the beginnings, at least in Jewish tradition, of the oral law commencing with the role of Ezra, who came back to teach the Torah and to teach the people how to live out their lives in obedience to the commandments that they had for so long abandoned. They had abandoned the covenant that led to their exile. One of the key issues, of course, in this discussion of the oral tradition becomes the role of the Sabbath. And so we talked about the role of the high priest and leadership, but one of the keys to understanding the broader picture of the context of Jesus' ministry is understanding how the role of the Sabbath had become primary in the life of Israel. And we go back to the teachings of the Torah in Exodus through Deuteronomy in particular. Sabbath was a sign of creation and it was a sign of the covenant relationship. And so keeping the Sabbath became exemplary and the model for your being described as faithful to the Torah and faithful to God. And so in that, Isaiah and Jeremiah, for example, had both proclaimed that the Israelites would go into exile because they disobeyed the Sabbath, which meant they disobeyed the covenant, and hence Sabbath laws became primary. And so the Sabbath becomes the most discussed and is extensively described in the literature of this interbiblical era that eventually comes into a written form in what we call the Mishnah. But that's 200 AD. But again, we talk about developments that started in the Persian period and the role of leadership on the priestly realm and on the Torah teaching, and hence the leadership of the scribes and the Pharisees that we read about in the New Testament has its origins back in this interbiblical period, starting with Persia and carries on through the Hellenistic period. Again, during the Persian period, the life of the Jews was relatively calm in relationship to the government. Again, their main adversaries were the Samaritans to the north for a brief period in the 5th century. But as we come into the time of Alexander, the world is going to change with the advent of Greek philosophy, Greek religion, and its impact during what we call the Hellenistic period, beginning after Alexander's conquest of the region in the 330s and 320s BC. So with that, in the context of the Hellenistic period, we have what is called land contracts and promissory territories given to the leaders of Alexander's army. And so during this Hellenistic period, land grants were given to different groups that eventually, for example, would emerge in the territory called the Decapolis. So, for example, the Old Testament city of Beit-Sha'an, which came to be known as Scythopolis, the city of the Scythians. Scythians were a major mercenary group under Alexander. And so we have the beginning of Hellenistic cities, Greek way of life, and Greek philosophy and theology, and the worship of Greek deities in these various cities, and the impact which would eventually, of course, also impact Jerusalem. And so in this Hellenistic period, first overruled by the Ptolemies during the 3rd century BC, followed by the Seleucids in the 2nd century BC, is a period of gradual growing influence of Hellenism upon the Jewish way of life. And so, for example, in this era we have the establishment of the Greek theaters, amphitheaters, we have odeons, the musical assemblies, and we have the gymnasium. The gymnasium was the center not simply of athletic activity, but of political and social discussion and the livelihood and the philosophy of Hellenism. And if you wanted to do business with the Greeks, you had to identify with where business was happening. And the gymnasium was very much a center. For Jewish life, the center became the synagogue, but that's a little bit later in the history. But one of the things that we see in this time period is the influence of Hellenism among a number of Jewish businessmen, and that becomes an issue that impacts the religious character of Israel. But as we move into the Seleucid periods, after, again, the Seleucids had battled with the Ptolemies in 4 different campaigns through the 3rd century BC, we're coming to around 198 BC when the Seleucid king, Antiochus III, and Seleucus defeat the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panias, later on, and the location of Caesarea Philippi in the New Testament era. The Seleucids come into control, and when we come to the reign of Antiochus IV, beginning around 175, increased pressure on the Jews to follow the Greek way of life and the Greek religion, to the point where Antiochus desecrates the temple by tearing down the altar to the Lord, erecting an altar to Greek deity and deities, and establishing sacrificing of unclean animals in the temple that leads to the desecration of the temple. That precipitates the revolt of the Maccabean leaders under Mattathias and his sons, beginning with Judas, followed by Jonathan and Simon, which lead to the revolution and the eventual freedom of the territory of Judea from Hellenistic domination. It takes several decades to do so. But by the time we get down to John Hyrcanus, Alexander Jannaeus, we have an independent kingdom that unfortunately comes to an end as a result of infighting. We have in this era the emergence, in the reign of John Hyrcanus, the emergence of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and perhaps beginnings of the counter movement of the Essenes, if we look at the backdrop of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So again, this context of the Jewish world that we find in the New Testament, in the life of Herod, and then into the life of Jesus and his ministry, comes out of the developments, religious, political, and economic, of this Persian, Hellenistic, and early Roman period.